Hear me fine?
Yes, I can.
There we go. Hello, I'm
Hi.
Tanyo. Hi, I'm Tanyo and a DIL Ambassador from the UK. Today we are joined by Miss Johnson from the US to discuss the IELTS test learning procedures and learning styles. Let's see. A brief on Miss Johnson. Miss Johnson is a language assessment specialist and with a background in English language instruction. Hi, Miss Johnson. Thank you
Morning.
for joining us here today. And
Or good afternoon, good evening, wherever people may be.
wherever you are in the world. Yes, Miss, a warm welcome on behalf of all of the ambassadors who are joining us from Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, the UK, and Morocco. If I've missed anyone, I shall see it later.
Okay.
Before I hand over to Miss Johnson, I would like to ask politely, please turn your mics and cameras off. We've all got our notepads ready, so without further ado, on to you, Miss Johnson.
Thank you.
That's all right.
So I will be presenting a PowerPoint presentation first with sort of an overview of what the IELTS exam is, the format, a few tips here and there about maybe what you should be looking at when you're preparing for the IELTS. And I've also tried to answer the questions that many of you had and that I received beforehand. And then after I finish the presentation, we can open it up for more questions if there's anything else that people need clarification about. I'll also provide the PowerPoint presentation to the group so that you can refer to it later. But there are some links to useful resources for you so that you'll have that available to you. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now with the PowerPoint. I think you need to allow me to share my screen, Tanyo.
Okay.
It says it's been disabled.
Hold on. Just checking settings. That should be fine.
Okay, now it's allowing me to, yes. Okay, so hopefully you can all see an IELTS, preparing for IELTS title page here.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so yes, this is a presentation about preparing for IELTS. It is by no means exhaustive, as there's a lot of information to be covered about the IELTS exam, but I've tried to give you a general overview and some recommendations for things you may want to look into further before you take the IELTS. So what is IELTS? It is an acronym that stands for International English Language Testing System. This is an exam that has been used around the world for many years now. It started out probably most of all being used for people who were planning to study in English-speaking universities, but it's been developed for a number of different purposes over the years. It's an English language test, obviously, that's designed to measure the proficiency levels of people who plan to work or study where English is the language of communication. So even in countries that aren't using English as their first language, people are often asked to take the IELTS to prove their ability to speak or use English. I know that in Saudi Arabia, many of my students had to take IELTS either for their work or to go on to study, even within Saudi Arabia. So it's become a kind of a worldwide benchmark for English language proficiency. And I think most people are familiar that there is a scale of bands used to describe these proficiency levels, ranging from band 1 which would be somebody who's not able to use English really, up to a band 9, which would be a near native or expert level of English use. There are 2 types of IELTS tests. Again, I think most people are aware of this. The first one is called IELTS Academic. This is used for people that are applying to higher education programs, or perhaps that need professional certification or registration in English-speaking environments. So people who are maybe going to study medicine or law or engineering or something that requires them to have some sort of a professional registration. This exam would contain more academic language with respect to the general training test, and it would assess a test taker's readiness for study or training. So we're trying to determine, is this person prepared to study in an English-speaking environment or work if they're for looking for professional registration. The general training exam is used more for people who are going to do secondary education. So high school students might take the general training. People who are looking for work experience or training programs in English-speaking countries. So if you're just going abroad to work or to get some sort of additional training, you may only need to take IELTS general training. It's also required for anyone who's planning to migrate to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the UK. So people who are just moving abroad are asked to take the test as well to prove their proficiency level. And this would focus more on basic or what we call survival skills, and it would cover broad social and work contexts. So which IELTS exam is right for me? Sorry, my mouse is very sensitive. Okay, if you're planning to attend university in an English-speaking country, then the IELTS Academic is probably the test you should be preparing for. However, if you're planning to move to an English-speaking country just for work or some sort of training, IELTS general training may be appropriate for you. But you should always check with the institution, the potential employer, whoever it is that's requiring you to take the exam, find out what their specific requirements are, because each organization will have different requirements. Then we're going to go through the test format now. So both the IELTS Academic and General Training exams will test the 4 skills of English, and those are listening, reading, writing, and speaking. The total time for the test is 2 hours and 45 minutes. However, the listening, reading, and writing sections are completed on the same day, and there are no breaks in between those sections. So you'll sit for about 2.5 hours to take listening, reading, and writing. I mean, there'll be short breaks in between, but nothing too long. Then speaking would be taking place in a separate session, and that could either be a week before or a week after you take the other tests. So up to a week before, up to a week after, they'll schedule you for a separate session for your speaking exam. Also because that's done one-on-one with an IELTS examiner. So there's a face-to-face component there. So for the listening, the format is as follows. It will last 30 minutes, and then test takers are given an extra 10 minutes to transfer their answers to the answer sheet. So you can mark your answers in the booklet, and then you'll move them over to the answer sheet in the last 10 minutes. There'll be 40 questions in this section, and the types of questions range from multiple choice, matching. You may have to label a plan or a map or a diagram. You may have to complete a summary about a form or a note, a table, a flowchart, and there's also sentence completion for listening. There are also 4 recordings, so you'll hear native English speakers in these scenarios. The first one would be a conversation between 2 people in an everyday social context. The second recording is usually a monologue, which is one person speaking, again, set in an everyday social context. So it may be something about someone talking about local facilities, a library, or something like that. The third recording is a conversation that could be, could have up to 4 people talking. And this would be set in an educational or training context. So like a university tutor and students discussing an assignment or something similar. And the final and fourth recording is a monologue on an academic subject. So it would be like listening to a lecture at a university. Then the reading for academic IELTS, this is 60 minutes long. You do not have any extra time to transfer your answers to the answer page on the paper-based exam. 40 questions again, and there'll be 3 long reading passages. These will range from descriptive and factual texts to more discursive and analytical texts. So it could be anything from like what you would see in a book, an academic journal, a magazine, a newspaper. And again, types of questions, there's many different types that can appear on this test. You'll have multiple choice, identifying information, identifying the writer's claims or views. So that might be more like an opinion article you'd be reading and then talk about the author's views. You may have to match information. You may have to match headings or features of a text or sentence endings, even the way a sentence you'd expect it to be completed. You may have to complete a sentence, so fill in like the end of the sentence. You may have to complete a summary of the text. There are also completion of notes, tables, and flowcharts, as well as diagram labels, and then there are what we refer to as short answer questions. So you just give a brief answer to a question that appears after the passage. Then on the general training reading, again, it's 60 minutes long, same as the academic, 40 questions as well. This has 3 sections, so it's a little bit different than the academic because the length of the texts are a little bit different. Section 1 would have 2 or 3 short or even several shorter texts. So it might just be like a sign or a bulletin board, something like that. Section 2 would have 2 texts, and section 3 would have 1 long text. These passages are similar to what you would see in books, magazines, newspapers, notices, advertisements, company handbooks, and guidelines. And again, the types of questions are listed here, very similar or almost identical to the academic reading types of questions that would appear on the test. Okay, then academic writing. This is probably the most difficult section of the test for most people. You have 60 minutes to complete 2 tasks for the academic writing test. The first task, there's two questions or prompts. The first one is a graph, table, or chart, or a diagram that you're asked to summarize or explain information about the graph in about 150 words, and you're given 20 minutes to do that. Task 2, you're asked to write an essay in response to a point of view, an argument, or a problem. That should be 250 words, and you have 40 minutes to complete that task. Both of these tasks should have a formal style. You should be writing in a more formal style since it's an academic test. And test takers will be penalized if answers are too short, so make sure that you do write the minimum word count for these tasks. And also make sure that you spend the recommended amount of time. So for task 1, 20 minutes, task 2, 40 minutes, because task 2 is actually worth twice as much as task 1 for the overall writing band score. So it's double in weight with respect to task 1. So you want to make sure you leave yourself enough time for task 2. So one thing I want to show you is the marking criteria that is used for these tasks, because it's important that people are familiar with how they're going to be assessed. These versions of the marking criteria are actually public versions and are available for people to see online. I'm hoping it's going to pull it up for me. Okay, there it is, yeah. So you can look at this to see how the people that are going to mark your exam, what are they looking for? So there's 4 categories or aspects that we look for when we mark a paper. And the first one is called task achievement. So are you doing what you were asked to do in the task? Is that, that's essentially what we're looking for. Then we talk about coherence and cohesion. This is kind of what is often referred to as the organization of the paper, how well or how easy it is to read the paper. Do you use transitions? Do you use linking words? Is the paper organized in a logical sequence? Those types of things. Then we also look at what we call lexical resource, which is simply vocabulary. How well are you using your vocabulary when you're writing this test? And this is kind of a key area to get a higher score in IELTS. If you're able to use more colloquial expressions or idiomatic expressions, that helps, but you have to make sure that you're using them correctly as well. This is also where we're looking at spelling and the correct word usage. So are you using the right word in the right way? Sometimes people will throw words in and they're not really sure what they mean. So make sure that you know the word if you're using it in your paper. And then the last area is called grammatical range and accuracy. This is where we're looking at grammar, how well you're able to create sentences using either simple language or more complex language. So the more complex you use and the more accurately you use it, the higher a band you'll score. So it's really important that you get familiar with what each of these bands requires, because when examiners score the papers, they're looking at, okay, let's say I start looking at a paper and I think, okay, this is probably about a 5, and I'm looking at their grammar. Did they do this point? Yes. Did they do this point? Yes. Did they do this point? No. So then you're probably going to be stuck at a 5. To move up to a 6, you need to do all of these plus some of these, okay? So there's also a similar rubric or marking criteria for the task 2. That one's very similar to task 1. The only difference is instead of task response, they call it task achievement, but the other categories are the same. And here they're looking to make sure that your position or response is clearly developed for your essay. So you do want to make sure that you're presenting your opinion or your position on this subject that they give you. Okay. Okay, so then the general training writing is similar to the academic training in the sense that it is, again, 60 minutes and there's 2 questions or tasks. However, the type of task changes. So instead of having a graph or chart or a table in task 1, you'll be writing an informal, semi-formal, or formal letter in response to a common everyday situation. Again, it's a 150-word limit in 20 minutes. So whether it's informal, semi-formal, or formal will depend on the situation and the recipient. So if you're writing to your classmate, you'll probably be using a more informal style. If you're writing to a professor, a university staff member, or a government official, then you're going to be using a formal tone. Task 2 it's a semi-formal essay on a general interest topic. So this is similar to the task 2, but it's more general topics than academic. And again, responses to, oh, sorry, this is not true here. Responses to both tasks may be formal or informal, depending on what the situation is. Again, if answers are too short, test takers can be penalized. And again, task 2 is twice as much as task 1. So make sure that you're allowing yourself enough time for task 2. And the public versions of the marking criteria or band descriptors are the same for tasks 1 and 2. So it's similar breakdown as to the academic. For the speaking exam, again, this will be in a separate session, face-to-face with an examiner, one examiner and one test taker. So it will be 11 to 14 minutes. The number of questions may vary depending how short or long the test taker's answers are. But essentially there are 3 parts to the speaking exam. First part is an introduction, an interview. This is where the examiner will ask more personal or general questions. Topics would be home, family, work, studies, interests. And this part of the test will last anywhere between 4 and 5 minutes. This is sort of a warm-up stage just to get you comfortable, to get you familiar with the examiner. And then part 2 is what we call the long turn. In this part, the examiner will give you a card with a particular topic that you'll need to talk about. It'll explain the topic. They'll also give you a piece of paper and a pencil to make notes if you'd like to. And you have 1 minute to prepare before you start speaking. You're expected to speak for up to 2 minutes. The longer you can speak, the better. The examiner may interrupt you and tell you thank you. That's fine to finish the time that you're allowed to speak. And then they'll probably ask you 1 or 2 follow-up questions. And this part of the test should be about 3 to 4 minutes long. And then part 3, the discussion. Sorry. This will be some additional questions that will be related in some way to the topic you talked about in part 2, but they will be more abstract ideas that you'll be trying to discuss with the examiner. And this could last anywhere between 4 and 5 minutes, depending on how long your answers are, how many questions the examiner asks you. Okay. And then there's also marking criteria for the speaking section that you should be familiar with. So in this section of the exam, it's the same for all test takers, whether they're taking academic or general. What we're looking for in a speaking exam is the fluency and coherence. So this is how well are you speaking? How easy is it for the listener to understand you? We look for things like pausing, self-correction when you start a sentence again. If you're able to develop a topic in a coherent way, again, it has to do with organization. Is it easy to follow what you're saying? Those kinds of things. And then we also look at lexical resources when you're doing speaking. So again, this is your vocabulary usage. How broad of a vocabulary are you able to use when you speak? Are you using it accurately, correctly? Are you, excuse me, are you making the correct word choices when you're speaking? We're also looking at grammatical range and accuracy, similar to the writing exam. Here, again, it's how accurate and how complex is the language that you're using. Some people may only be able to speak in simple sentences, so they'd be, looking at a score somewhere around a 5 or a 4. When you get up to levels 6, 7, 8, that's where you start using more complex structures, maybe not as accurately or as flexibly as somebody at an 8 or a 9, which is a near native speaker. But if you're around a 6 or a 7, that means you're able to, use more complex language. Pronunciation is the final category we're looking at. And these are things like how well you can pronounce the words. How we look at things like sentence stress and word stress as well. So your enunciation, your tone, your intonation, all of those kinds of things are considered when we evaluate pronunciation. And this is essentially, is your speech intelligible? Can we understand you in terms of the phonetics? Okay. So these are the types of things that you should be familiar with when you're thinking about speaking. Now I have some questions here that were sent to me by Tanyo from the group members. So I'm trying to give you the answers to these questions and also provide you with some resources that you can use when you're preparing for IELTS. So the first question we have is, how can I improve my reading speed? I don't have a problem with comprehension, but due to time constraint, I'm unable to do reading comprehension questions. This is something a lot of people worry about. They feel like they have to read the entire passage quickly, but then they're maybe not able to understand everything if they read it too quickly. So this is something that's difficult for many people. And my answer to this is you should be able to maybe try to scan a reading passage to quickly locate the relevant information you need. You don't always need to read every single word in a passage. You can just look quickly across, the lines or the paragraphs. And this is done so that you can spot some key words, and then you'll use those when you're answering questions. So if you see a specific word that is also in one of the questions, you'll know, okay, this is probably an important word to be looking for in the text. You don't always need to understand every single word to answer the questions, especially because only certain types of questions would require a more thorough understanding of a passage. So something like matching headings or choosing a title, you're going to need to understand what the entire text is about, probably, maybe not every single word. But those two types of questions, yes, it's important to know. A lot of the other questions will rely on reading skills like skimming and scanning. So you're looking for specific information in a text. Next question was, in many books, I've seen their reading passages given to practice. Do we need to learn vocabulary words too for writing? Well, the short answer to this is yes, because improving your English vocabulary knowledge will help you on all parts of the IELTS exam. This is probably one of the most important parts of preparing for IELTS, is improving your vocabulary, expanding your vocabulary. The bigger vocabulary you have, the more you'll be able to do on all parts of the test. In particular for the writing section, it's important to be able to accurately use a wide range of vocabulary, since this is one of the categories the test takers are assessed on, and that's what we were just looking at before, was the lexical resources. They're looking at how well you're able to use vocabulary, how big of a range of vocabulary you have to use when you're writing. And then just be aware of some common themes that appear on IELTS tests, especially for the writing and the speaking section. So if you can familiarize yourself with vocabulary related to these areas, it would be particularly helpful. We've got areas like education, crime, diet, fitness and health, work, information technology, environment, science, and the arts. So those areas, if you can sort of study up on vocabulary related to those areas, that would probably be the best thing that you can do in terms of developing vocabulary. All right, the next question says, academic IELTS is slightly different from general IELTS when it comes to writing. There's a graph in academic writing which I find most difficult. Could you give some tips to improve that? Well, there's lots of things you can do to improve your writing, especially for this task 1, and there's a lot of resources on the internet available for free that can help you improve your writing for the task 1. However, some things that I wanted to point out, what you should keep in mind is that this task is meant to be just a description or explanation of the information in the graph, chart, table, diagram, whatever they give you. In this section, they're not looking for the test taker to provide their own interpretation of what the data means. You're just describing the data. You're explaining what's on the chart, what's on the graph. You don't need to say, I think this is because, or the reason for this is that. You're not trying to interpret the data. Just explain it, describe it, okay? You should be looking for general trends or patterns in a graph. There's no need to include minor details. You also should probably try to figure out whether the graph is a comparison or a progression or both. Sometimes the graph compares two separate categories. Sometimes it shows trends over time, so progression. Sometimes it could be a combination of both things. There could be two countries and their economic trends over 10 years or something like that. So you're looking to make sure you understand what is it that this graph is showing here. And then also make sure you're using varied vocabulary throughout the response. There are many ways to say the same thing. So for example, a slight increase could also be phrased as increased slightly. Try to make sure you have some variety rather than repeating the same words over and over again in your writing. In the notes sections of these PowerPoints, I've included some websites that are particularly helpful. So when I send this presentation to Tanyo, make sure that you check in the notes. They're also listed at the end on a slide called Useful Resources, but I think I have more detailed information or the exact page for these specific questions where they apply. Okay. Yeah, this one is about, what about students who stutter naturally? Do they lose marks in speaking because they cannot be fluent? They shouldn't if you inform the test center or when you register for the exam, you should inform people that you have either recognized impairment or disability if that's the case. So if this is a problem that you have had diagnosed or is a recognized problem, such as, it can be anything from visual impairment, hearing impairment, speech impairment, attention deficit disorder. IELTS will provide special accommodations for people who have these types of impairments or disabilities. So differently abled test takers have the right to be given different accommodations, but you need to inform them ahead of time. That's the key. Make sure they're aware of it when you register for the test. Oops, sorry, I missed this one. I'll fill this in later, but what do you suggest if I'm struggling with a question in the listening section? Should I skip that and move on to the other one or try to figure it out first? This one's a bit difficult because in the listening, it's hard to go back and remember what you heard in the listening script. So if you can spend a little bit of time trying to figure it out, sure, take the time, try to figure it out, or make your best guess. I guess that's, rather than leave it blank, I would at least maybe indicate, okay, I think it's this one, it might be something else. Because if you move on to, maybe you're on question 4 and you're having trouble with it, and you then move on and do another 36 questions, by the time you come back to question 4, you're not going to remember what you heard. So particularly for the listening section, it's better to try to get an answer down right after you listen to the text. It may not be the right answer, you may have to guess, but it's better than leaving it blank. In reading passages, there are different views. You should read the questions first, or you should read the paragraph first. What do you recommend? Well, I think that this one depends on the length of the passage and the type of the question you're dealing with. Shorter passages, certain types of questions like matching, there may not even really be any questions per se to read, so you may just have to go right into the task. For longer passages, it's probably wise to read the questions before you read the passage, because this will help test takers get an idea of what the passage is about overall. You can also look for some of those keywords that you're going to be watching out for when you're reading or scanning the passage. So if you read the question that says, how many airplanes were developed by the Wright brothers, for example, or something like that, you're going to know, okay, I'm looking for the words Wright brothers, airplanes. Those are keywords that I need to be seeing in the passage when I read it. The next question, are there questions related to grammar? How can we prepare for that? there aren't direct or specific questions about grammar, like what is the past tense of went, go? So nothing like that, but you are going to be assessed on your ability to use grammar correctly, as we've seen when we looked at the marking criteria for the writing and speaking sections of the exam. So particularly there, it's important to make sure that you understand grammar. Also, certain types of reading questions, such as sentence completion or summary completion, will involve using correct grammar to get full points. And then much like improving your vocabulary skills, if you improve your grammar skills, it's going to benefit you on all parts of the exam. So there should be some preparation in terms of grammar and vocabulary when you're studying for an IELTS exam. We have a choice to take a paper-based IELTS or online exam. Which do you think is better? I don't know that one is better than the other. It's mainly about how comfortable test takers are with using the computer and a keyboard to take an exam. If you don't type very fast and you can write faster than you can type, then I'd suggest you take the paper-based exam. If instead you're really familiar with using a computer, you prefer to write on a keyboard, then you might want to be taking the online version. The content is exactly the same in both versions, so you'll get the same content online that you would in a paper-based exam. You'll still have to do like short answer, fill in the blank type questions. It's not going to be just multiple choice on an online exam. There are a variety of different types of questions. For the online version, you'll only do listening, reading, and writing. You'll still have to do your speaking face-to-face with an examiner. And the only other difference that I wanted to point out is how quickly you'll receive the results. Online results are usually available like 5 to 7 days after you take the test. Paper-based results can take up to 13 days, sometimes longer, to receive. So that could be a factor if you're on a deadline for something. It may be better to take the online version. Okay, and then this last slide is some links to useful resources. The first one is just the IELTS homepage. This is where you can find tons of information, practice tests, things like that. So make sure that you explore that website quite well. There's a few others that I think are pretty good in giving you tips for preparation for IELTS, broken down by skill. So IELTS Buddy is one, IELTS Liz, Learn About IELTS, Top 5 Best Websites. There's a variety of other websites when you click on this one, and the same thing here, top 10 best websites to study IELTS. So those are different resources you can use. There's a lot of stuff available online for free. There are also practice tests that you can pay for. If you really want to simulate the test, that's probably the best way to go, is you get a previous exam or a practice IELTS exam that's officially issued by IELTS. The problem on that is to get somebody to score it for you, you'd have to find a service where they'll score your writing exam. Speaking is difficult unless you can find somebody who's familiar with the test to help you practice the speaking or simulate the speaking part. Usually those two areas are a little bit more difficult to prepare for. Listening and reading, there's a lot out there. But speaking and writing, you can do the writing, there's a lot of prompts, but you need to have somebody that's familiar with how these exams are marked to give you feedback so that you can improve your writing. Okay, so that's my presentation. I'm sure there's questions, so we can open it up for people.
Hi,
and I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Does anyone have any questions for Ms. Johnson? Feel free to ask now while you have the opportunity. I'll start. Hi, Ms. Johnson. Again, it's Tanyo. You mentioned writing exams, that there's little out there that people can use. Would you recommend any sites or resources that people can access to hand in their writing exams and get marked?
And get the feedback, get it marked, you mean?
Yes.
There probably are. I'm not sure right now which are the best ones out there, but I can look into it and add it to the presentation if I find something that I think is worthwhile. I don't know. I'm guessing there's going to be a fee involved in something like that because it takes time to mark the exams. The important thing is that you understand how qualified this person is that's supposed to be marking, you know, your practice tests for you. If you know somebody in person who either used to be an examiner or is an examiner, that would be the best solution, is get somebody who's actually worked as an examiner before to mark it for you. But I know that there could be a conflict of interest if they're actually currently examining. They're not supposed to advertise that they are examiners or anything like that. So it might be hard to find somebody, you know.
Okay,
but if you can find somebody who either taught a course for IELTS preparation, there's quite a few out there, but I'll try to find some specific sources for you.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
I have one more question for you.
Sure.
From your experience, what do students tend to focus too little on? Maybe there's a general theme that people focus too little on.
I think people get too caught up in probably what the exam looks like, what the specific questions are, and don't work enough on developing vocabulary and grammar like we talked about. A lot of it is just building your vocabulary, honing your grammar skills, and that can be done in any number of ways. It doesn't have to be specific to IELTS. But I do think also people do need to prepare for a certain amount of time before they attempt an IELTS exam, because it is a rather specific type of test. So you do need to be familiar with the types of questions you're going to encounter, with the tasks that you're asked to do on the writing. So I would say you probably need at least 3 months minimum to prepare well for an IELTS exam, and not feel like you've wasted your money. You know, I wouldn't suggest people just sign up today and take the test tomorrow unless they're familiar with it.
Okay. Thank you for that. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask?
Yes, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Thank you. Edward, go ahead.
Okay. So on the various slides, you showed us that the IELTS exam has various formats. There's the general, there's the academic, yes?
Mm-hmm.
So I figured if I write an exam for the general IELTS, can I use that to gain admission to schools and other places like that?
The general is usually not accepted by universities. So if you're talking about universities, probably not. As I said, each organization is going to have their own requirement for what kind of an exam they'll accept. Most universities will accept IELTS academic or TOEFL are the two exams that most universities will accept. Depends on where the university is located. In Europe, they tend to take IELTS over TOEFL. In Asia, they maybe will be taking TOEFL instead of IELTS, but usually nowadays they take both. If you're looking to study in the UK, obviously IELTS. In the US, it's TOEFL. So you kind of need to find out, you know, if you're applying to a variety of different universities in Asia, for example, you're probably going to want to maybe take TOEFL over IELTS. But if you're looking to study somewhere in Europe, then IELTS is probably the better way to go.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you. Did anyone else have any questions before we wrap it up?
I'll also add my email to the end of the presentation so that if anyone does think of anything afterwards, they can feel free to email me and ask the question by email.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, well, thank you, Ms. Johnson, for your time today and for the abundance of information you gave us, your tips and sharing. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I'm sure we all learned exactly something new, at least, and I'm excited to see what the ambassadors have to say after the call.
Great. And if anybody's interested in more specific information on a given skill, if you want to do a workshop on just writing, we could arrange for something like that at another date.
Exactly. And Miss Johnson's email will be attached. So thank you.
Okay, great. Nice to speak to you all this morning.
See you from the UK. Bye.
Okay, thank you again.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Bye.
Sure. Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.